Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Stories for Dark and Stormy Nights, Volume 7, Story 1. Two buddies that shared a house with me were driving home from the mountains at midnight. They were about 8 miles outside of the city in the farmland, and the fog was super heavy. No homes around. They came to a country road intersection. There was a very old woman standing on the corner dressed all in black and old-fashioned clothing, tightly clutching a purse with both hands. Her face was white, too white. She was just standing and staring. My buddies freaked out. They stepped on the gas and got the hell out of there. They woke me up when they got home because they just had to tell me all about it. They were totally freaked out. They kept saying that it wasn't a person, that it was a ghost. The driver said, that was the Grim Reaper, the angel of death. It means someone's gonna die. I just kind of laughed it off. Some months later, my friend, who was driving that night, was robbed, taken outside of the city on that same country road, had a shotgun held up to the side of his head, and they pulled the trigger. He had real blonde hair. There was so much blood that the deceased was reported as a redhead. Fast forward about 25 years, I came across a local online post about people seeing the same old woman standing in that spot on the road. People were chiming in left and right about seeing her over the years, always dressed the same, real white face. They all agreed on one thing. It wasn't a person, it was a ghost. They said who she was, and she had been killed in that spot on the road long, long ago. I don't drive that road at midnight anymore. Story number 2. It was mid-July of 1976. I was in the process of moving from Portland, Oregon area down to San Francisco to go to graduate school at Stanford, and my older brother was helping me with the driving. For reasons I can't remember anymore, we decided to take a few days off along the way and go backpacking in the Marble Mountain Wilderness area. That particular location is about 40 miles south of the Oregon border and about midway between Mount Shasta and the Pacific coast, right in the center of Sasquatch country, as I was later to find out. After driving to the trailhead and parking our vehicle there, we started out hiking around 11 a.m., as I recall. I'm pretty sure we hiked up that trail, the one that generally follows Boulder Creek up to Lower and Upper Wright Lakes. We arrived at Upper Wright Lake in late afternoon and made camp in a designated campsite about 20 yards from the water's edge. The first night passed without incident, but late in the morning of the second day, a troop of maybe 15 Girl Scouts, aged about 12 to 18, arrived, announced that they were on a planned 3-day overnight camping trip and that they would be sharing the camp with us. No problem, we said. Next morning, I decided I would like to get away from the giggly girls for a few hours, so I announced that I was going to hike up the high country behind the lake and see what I could find. There are lakes there, sitting in glacial scoured basins, with steep slopes rising up behind them. So it's about 11 a.m. I started out on the trail up to the high country. The trail switched back around one end of the lake, getting about 300 feet of altitude quickly and eventually going through a little pass that opened up onto a pleasant meadow filled with lupine. The pass still had a small snow patch in it, in the shadowed north-facing parts. As I followed the trail across the snow patch, I noticed that many boots had walked across it and trampled the snow down to a muddy mess, but that off to the side, the snow was still in pristine condition, except for being covered with a thin layer of yellow pine pollen. I continued on my way up the trail and spent a couple of hours just soaking in the beauty and serenity of the place, ate my granola bar, and then decided to make my way back down to camp. As I came back to the snow-filled pass, I noticed that the snow that had been undisturbed on my way up had some new markings on it. The first thing I noticed was that something had mashed into the snow just a few inches to one side of the muddy path I was following. I knelt down to take a closer look, and after a few seconds realized that the depression in the snow had the shape of a bare 5-toed foot. The snow depth at that particular point was about 4 inches, and whatever made the print had compressed the entire layer of snow right down to the ground, except for the spaces between the toes. In the spaces between what would have been the toes, the snow was still standing and the layer of yellow pine pollen was still undisturbed. I counted what would have been the toes, and there were 5. They went from one side of the print to the other in descending order of size. Behind the toes there was a solid depression caused by what would have been the ball of the foot, followed by what would have been the heel. By this time I had run out of hypothesis for what this could be, other than a large, human-looking footprint. As I was pondering this realization, it dawned on me that if there was one print, there would almost certainly be more than one. I looked back up the snowfield in the opposite direction from where the footprints were pointing, and, sure enough, there was another one about 4 feet away. The same distance further up, there was another one. Looking down trail, there was a 4th print that was half on the snow and half on the mud. The first print I saw would have been a right foot. The previous print up the hill was a left print. The one above that one was another right print. The 4th one down the hill was another left. Whatever made the prints was walking in a regular left-right-left cadence. I decided to estimate the distance between prints. I took the longest stride I could comfortably manage, later measured at 36 inches, and estimated that the stride of whatever made the prints was about 50% longer than my stride, about 4.5 feet. I found a small pine stick and cut marks into it with my knife to record the length and width of the print. Later, when I got home, it turned out to be about 7 inches wide and 16 inches long. By that time, I'd exhausted every possibility and had to conclude that sometime between when I came through the pass going uphill and came through going downhill, a large bipedal creature with hominid bare feet had passed over the same trail. I suddenly felt very small and started wondering how far away could such a creature be. I can't say for absolute certain that Sasquatch are real, but I can say with absolute certainty that Sasquatch footprints are real. And no, I didn't tell the Girl Scouts or my brother what I had seen that day until we were safely out of the woods. Maybe I'll burn in hell for that decision. Next story. This is not a second telling. I was there. It was back in the late 80s. A couple of my brothers, some friends, and I decided to explore Dungeon Rock. This is a place in Lynn, Massachusetts. We planned ahead, took 3 flashlights, and most importantly, one of the best lockpicks we knew. Billy, rest in peace, was a genius, but applied his vast knowledge in society's less favorable trades. It was a well-known secret that he could open most locks in seconds. One's imagination could figure out the rest when it applied to his skills and how he used them in his private world. Back to the story. At the time, we all thought Dungeon Rock was a place where Blackbeard buried his treasure, but in fact, history records he was really a pirate named Thomas Veal. Dungeon Rock, or DR from this point on, is a strange and eerily quiet spot in the middle of the woods. It seemed to always become dead quiet before you realized it. On the way into the woods, there are many sounds of birds and small animals, but not in the vicinity around DR. The entrance to the dungeon is located between a split in the bedrock. At the time, there was a very old, sturdy, thick metal barred door. This door was double locked, but Billy, our 2-legged can opener, opened that door as easy as if he had a key. He, more than once, looked me straight in the eyes and said, in that very quiet, single-toned voice of his, "Locks are a lot like drugs. Makes you feel good until you realize what a waste they are when everything in your life is gone." We all started down the short flight of old wooden steps. DR is carved right out of the bedrock itself, very much like semi-round hole twisting into the earth like some sort of perverted stone spiral staircase, but without the stairs. Within a few feet from that door and staircase it was absolutely pitch black. Without that single opening, you are completely encased in solid rock. The floor is crushed stone, likely from the drilling machines or blasting from back in the day. The air, or lack of it, becomes oppressive as you get deeper. This is not the place to be if you have phobias of the dark or enclosed spaces. Not at all. As we were walking, Billy nonchalantly said, "I bet this is pretty much what it's like to wake up in a coffin buried alive." I said, "Yeah, pretty much, but thanks for the thoughts." If I knew then what I know about poisonous gases now, that leak from the depths that can kill you before you even know what's going on, I would have never gone down there without proper equipment. But we did, and to the bottom of that abyss. Here, at the bottom, where everything in my world is changed forever. Everyone from that expedition was affected, one of which pretty much became a basket case because of what was about to happen. In order to understand the events that would follow, there were 6 of us. 3 had flashlights. I was one of the light holders. My flashlight was ironically one of the kind that needed a good tap every once in a while to keep it on. This will become an important fact. As we came around the final twisting downward passage, we could go no further due to the fact of it being filled with water. It looked like a small pond of foul putrefied water. It was perfectly smooth and had what looked like moss or such floating on top. I was closest to the water's edge and almost touching the inner wall. Picture a spiral staircase, and if I was touching the center column. 2 people stood behind me at the time and also close to the inner wall. One of them had the second flashlight. The other 3 were closer to the outer wall, one of which had the third flashlight. Bo was one of those 3, the one without the light, and the next closest to the water, but about 8 feet from the water's edge. It suddenly became ice cold. I noticed my breath for the first time. I was just sweating the second before and should be warm this far underground. Everyone started asking the same thing. Is it getting ice cold down here? But before anyone could finish, came a breeze. I have to tell you right now, I do not exaggerate. There we all stood like statues, hundreds of feet encased in solid bedrock, trying to guess why or how an ice-cold breeze was coming from when all the flashlights went out in perfect unison. I kid you not. My first thought was everyone was messing around and that the other 2 flashlight holders were just waiting for me to blink my light on again so that they could shut theirs out in queue. But it was not to be, because just after that point, when the lights went out, you heard the most spine-chilling, terrified scream. All I could hear was someone fighting for their life. Then a sickening thud, dead silence, followed by what sounded like gravel being dragged, then splashing, then that horrid screaming again. I have to tell you, I'm the one in the group everyone looked to always keep his head. I decided to act. I started to yell for everyone to stop joking around. This is when I realized they all thought I was the one joking around, and it unhinged the whole group when they realized I was not. I was hammering my flashlight this whole time, but to no avail. The screaming stopped once again. I figured someone was dead this time for sure. I calmly told everyone in a stern voice, get to the inner wall and lock hands with the person in front of you and behind. I'm closest to the water's edge, so follow my voice to the wall and reach out with both hands once you do. Follow the wall until you touch the person in front of you. By the way, if anyone is messing around at this point, I know right now that you will be losing teeth once we get to the top. I was already almost against the inner wall. I reached my arm to the person in front of me, the upward direction, and just to make sure no one somehow got between me and the water, I reached my other hand in that direction. This is when things got bad. When I reached out with my hand toward the upward direction of the wall, I locked wrist with the person in front of me. My other hand, holding the flashlight, was now stretched out towards the water, slightly downward direction. I knew no one was in back of me, at least by this corner of the water's edge. Suddenly, I felt to what this day I can only describe as 3 bony fingers grab my hand. My hand and arm became like ice, causing me to drop my flashlight and yell out in true pain. This is very uncharacteristic. A painful yell from me because, with little confidence I gave to the group. Everyone started to panic. 6 strong young men started to lose it. Just as suddenly and strangely as the lights went out, they all came on just as perfectly as if they were one single flashlight. My light was on the ground, on. I was looking at a ripple in the water that was moving as if someone just went under. I looked to the other side of the wall, where our friend Bo used to be, last standing 8 feet from the water's edge, but now he was almost touching the water's edge, huddled in a ball, rocking back and forth like some poor rape victim. I grabbed my flashlight and walked over to him. We all did. He was in shock. He was cold and mumbling to himself over and over incoherently. He was wet from the mid-waist down. His left pant leg was torn to pieces. When I got closer and had a good look at him, he had a red bruise of a perfect handprint wrapped around his leg, right above his ankle. There were drag marks in the crushed stone floor, as if he was dragged from where he was last standing to where he sat huddled on the floor. He was like a zombie, and it was very difficult for us to carry him out. I lost touch with Bo many years ago, not due to my own fault. Bo withdrew from everyone over the course of months after we left DR. He never once spoke of it on his own accord, and would completely go nuts if we pressured him during that time, which we did, even threatened to hurt him if he didn't tell us what the hell exactly happened to him. We were young and didn't really mean it well, maybe a little, just to help jog his memory. He would always just laugh at us with his strange look and say, "You were there, you know. Now F off and die." He was committed to a puzzle factory, aka a sanitarium, about a year later, and we'll never forget it because it's how I came up with the name Puzzle Factory. During a visit, they actually had a Rubik's Cube on the table in front of some poor drooling soul who could do nothing but stare at the thing, looking very much the way you would picture a caveman trying to comprehend a cell phone. Why he was strapped to the chair was beyond me because he could only do the Thorazine shuffle, even if he wasn't locked down. I laughed then, but nowadays I don't find such things funny. I have never been back to DR and will never step foot inside that place again. Not because I'm afraid, it's just I feel that the place is like a graveyard, and it wasn't right to go down there. Getting it older and wiser about these things is when you realize it. In many ways, when I think back to those days, it helps me realize that there is more to this life than ever meets the eye. Next story. So, this is one of those stories that you're told as a kid, and you end up wondering if it's true or not. But the house that this story took place in is a really creepy place. But anyway, on with the story. Ben, my grandfather, moved into this house because it was cheap with his roommate. They had a construction company together or something along those lines. The house layout was something like this. My grandfather let his roommate take the master bedroom, and he slept in the living area for the first night. The first 2 days were like this. Then on the third day, the roommate walked out of the bedroom and said, "Ben, look, there's something in that room with me. I hear it every night. It sounds like snoring." Well, my grandfather thought it was an animal, so they went into the room and looked for an animal. Long story short, they didn't find one. Well, the next day, the roommate packed his bags and left, saying that whatever it was grabbed his arm. So my grandfather took over the master bedroom because his roommate wasn't there anymore. My grandfather heard the snoring. It was coming from the closet. He opened it up and heard what it really was. It was breathing, like someone having trouble breathing. My grandfather's tough, so he wasn't scared, but then things started happening. Objects moving around while he wasn't home, doors closing and opening. So one night Ben decided he'd had enough. He had probably been drinking whiskey, but anyways, he just said to the ghost, "You leave me alone, and I'll leave you alone. I don't know what you are, but we can both live here. Just leave me be." And he sealed off the bedroom, and that was the end of that. Supposedly, he was never bothered again. Other little pieces of info would be that he said the door to the master bedroom was always colder than the rest of the house, and my mom said that whenever Ben and my dad went out riding bikes and she was left alone in the house, she used to go outside because the thing used to close the doors, etc. So now I ask, does this sound true as to what ghosts actually do? Sounds like it does to me. Next story. When I was a teenager growing up in Maine, I spent a lot of time in the woods. Good thing, I loved it because there's plenty of it in Maine. We rarely went into the woods alone, kids being kids, you know. Everything was more fun with friends, but occasionally we did. I say we because something familiar to what I'm telling now happened to my closest friend at the time. So one late June afternoon when I was 15 or so, my friends were busy with whatever and I was bored, so I decided to take a walk up into the woods on the north side of the city. It was an overcast day, I remember, and sort of dreary. I walked through an area we called Brombones. I have no idea how we ended up calling this patch of woods that, but that's what we called it. And now to a clearing that sat just up on the ridge above where creek eventually flowed into Merry Meeting Bay. As I sat there, I started to feel a little weird, like I was being watched, but I thought maybe my friends had gotten done with whatever they had been doing and came out looking for me. So I got up and started to walk back the way I came to see if they were nearby. As I walked back the way I'd come, and it was about a mile back out of the woods to the street, I was starting to feel weirder. Yes, leaving that clearing and back into the tree line made it darker, so that was part of it, I'm sure. As I'm walking back, getting more and more amped up that I'm not alone, I looked behind me fairly frequently because I just felt like there was something that had been inside the trees when I walked back in and was now following me out. As I looked back, I saw a small woman. And I don't know how I know it was a woman, really, I just do. Well, in black Viet Cong pajamas and a Vietnamese farmer's hat. I'm not sure what they're called. She was behind me, maybe 50 feet or so, running in a north-south direction. I was going from west to east. She was carrying a rifle of some sort. I want to say it was an AK-47, but truthfully, I don't know. All I saw was that she was armed, running, and running away from me, which was good. But this was the mid-80s, so Vietnam wasn't nearly so far removed as it is now, so I was scared to death, and I got out of there back to the street as fast as I could. The funny, weird part of this is that my friend was there that afternoon looking for me. We just never crossed paths. He showed up at my parents' house later that day and told me he'd been up there looking for me, and without me saying so, he said, it was really weird too. I looked up once when I was getting near Brom Bones, and I saw this dude that was dressed like Robin Hood stand up, put an arrow in a bow, and drive back. I shut my eyes and shook my head and looked again, and he was gone. I should have told him about the Viet Cong woman I saw, but I didn't. I didn't dare to. It was just too weird. But then think again. He saw someone dressed like Robin Hood. Next story. My friend, let's call him Moron, was alone for a weekend. Well, his older brother was around, but his mom and dad were elsewhere. They were woods bordering Moron's home. I never thought anything of them. I grew up in the middle of some other woods. We're the same age. We were about 13 at that time. My mom dropped me off at Moron's. We were going to hang out there for a bit until my mom came back to take us out for pizza. Woohoo. I got out of the car, started towards the front door. Moron was sitting outside on his front steps waiting for me. Well, that's the first. Also, Moron is dark complected. He actually looks pale, and the kicker was he actually had a shotgun in his lap. I couldn't believe it. I was around guns all the time, but I didn't even know Moron's family had any, so it was a shock to see him with one. I got up there and said, hey. He got up and went inside before I could even finish. Of course, I followed him inside. He was moving fast, headed right for his parents' room. I followed him. I was just waiting for the punchline or whatever the Joker had in store for me. Instead, I see him gripping the shotgun, kind of hunkered down, peering out of the back window. I said, what the F are you doing? What's going on? They're still out there, Jack. I know it. Again, I asked, what the hell? Jack, I've been up all night. It started when it got dark. There was all this pounding and rustling in the woods. Trees started breaking, and they were throwing stuff against the pole barn. What are you talking about? I'm not effing around. Something is out there, and I'm scared. I know they're still there. At that point, I was mentally giving him credit for doing such an awesome job acting, doing his best to set me up for whatever he had in store for me. I said, bullshit, bring your gun and I'll take a look at the pole barn, see if there are any dents or stuff lying around. No, you are not going over there. Come on, are you really serious? So, we went outside. He called for one of their dogs, the only one in sight. We had her follow us to one side of the house. I went to move around to the back side, called her, not gonna happen. I really do started to think, what in the hell? So, I grabbed the dog's ruff and walked her to the corner. She dug in and I tried to drag her. She shook vigorously and she was gone. Took off like a shot across the road in the opposite direction. Now, I'm starting to feel spooked. Upon continued observation, Moron really is looking messed up. He won't let go of that shotgun. I told him, give me the gun. I have to see what's going on. He gave it to me and we started walking. I was actually starting to get nervous. I told him, besides, my mom's gonna be back soon, so we gotta go. We didn't even get to the edge of the woods. We started hearing an enormous crashing in the brush, the sound of huge, and I do mean huge, branches being cracked, and then stuff started banging off the pole shed. That shotgun was an old double barrel. I decided quick that I would shoot one barrel into the ground towards the wood as a warning shot. As soon as I did that, all hell broke loose. It felt like all the blood was draining from my head down to the soles of my feet, and like my bones were turning to jelly. I've never, ever seen anything like it before or since. I swear it looked as if the whole side of that forest suddenly broke out into a commotion. All the trees started shaking, branches waving, things banging, cracking, but it was like seeing it in slow motion. We didn't even know we were running until we were already in the field across the road. So, what the hell happened? The next day we saw that the pole shed was impressively dented, but there was nothing laying around to indicate what did it. There was never another incident like it, there or anywhere else around. I wonder if there was some weird aerosol in the air. It was so freaking weird. But there has got to be an explanation. Wish I knew what the answer is. Something possibly geologic? Maybe set it off even more with that blast from the shotgun as a catalyst? I really wish I knew what happened. But then I wondered, do I really want to know? Next story. This isn't my story, but the story of one of my dearest friends. I trust this person implicitly, and would put my life in his hands if it came down to that. He is completely trustworthy and one of those people who's completely open with everyone, and wouldn't even think of confabulating intentionally. He is very sane and mentally stable, has a family, etc. This took place in South Dakota. South Dakota is a pretty large area, so by not being more specific than that, I feel I'm adequately protecting his identity. Anyway, this is a story he told me. This happened in an extremely remote area. He was out walking with his shotgun for protection because the area was remote enough that wild animal attacks were not unheard of. There was a very large field behind a thick forested area, behind which was a fence high enough that it would be at least marginally difficult for an athletic adult human to scale. As he headed toward the tree line, he suddenly had an overwhelming sense and even a mental picture of a terrifying creature slinking around behind the fence. He felt like he shouldn't go over there, but he's the kind of person who can be sort of defiant toward his own fear, and basically made himself go and look regardless of his intuition. Suddenly, the exact creature he had seen in his mind's eye leaped over the fence to stand in the field before him, standing on two legs like a person, and stared him down. He described the creature as being black and hairy, with a solid abdomen. No tapering like a person, just straight down the trunk to the hips, and long arms with what appeared to be claws. The head was somewhat like a wolf or a dog, with an elongated snout and ears like a bear. It stood on its hind legs for several minutes staring at him, and its eyes held a human-like intelligence and acknowledgement. It was roughly 4.5 feet in height. He felt very afraid and thought to himself that he should shoot it if it approached him, but as soon as he had thought, his mind was flooded with imagery and information that essentially boiled down to, your gun is meaningless. You won't even get off one shot. If I want to kill you, you will die. There is nothing you can do about it, and no one will ever find out what happened to you. This terrified him, and he remembered being incredibly disturbed by this because he was a human being with a gun, and this was what surely had to be simply some sort of animal, except that it didn't look or act like an animal. After a minute or two, it vaulted, like a human going over a pole vault beam, back over the fence, using one hand to propel itself like a person might, seemed to land on its 2 feet and run away at high speed in a bipedal fashion. He has, for a decade or more now, looked at every photo of every animal anyone could think of that could describe this, including diseased and sick animals, and none of them even came close to looking like what he saw. No one else in the area ever saw it, and he has never returned to the location, citing an overwhelming fear that he was not wanted there. I do not assert that this really happened as he recalls it, or make any claims or suggestions as to what might have happened, but that was the story as he told it to me. Next story. This occurrence didn't happen to me, but to my grandmother. It would have taken place in the 1930s. My grandmother was a young teen at the time, and she lived with her mother and 5 siblings in an old house in the middle of the woods. The area was the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri. I had heard bits and pieces of stories from when they lived in the Ozarks, but it was always kept hush-hush. When I got to be about 12 or 13, I pestered my grandmother enough that she finally told me one thing that happened to her while living in the Ozark Mountains. My grandmother had gotten into a fight with her mother. She took off into the woods all day to get away from her for a while. When it got dark, she decided to come home. When she got home, the doors were locked and everyone was in bed. There was an old cot sitting outside the house, and she decided to just sleep on the cot until morning. In the morning, when she woke up, there was some creature sitting at the end of the cot. It's been 15 years since I heard this story, and she only told me once, so my memory's a little fuzzy. I remember she said it was really ugly and had a full set of sharp teeth. It was shaped like a person but didn't look like a person. She said that it just sat there and smiled at her with its abnormally large mouth of sharp teeth. When she started to get up from the cot to get away, it would start to get up and move towards her. When she would sit back down, it would sit back down. She sat there staring at it for a few seconds, and it continued to sit and smile at her. The creature was sitting between her and the front door. She finally jumped up and made a run for the back door. When she got to the back door, it was locked, but her mother was in the kitchen making biscuits. She was banging on the door, screaming to be let in, and her mother told her to go around to the front because her hands were covered in dough. My grandmother screamed she couldn't and was frantic enough that her mother ran to let her in. She told her mother what she'd seen. She had my grandmother's 2 brothers take the cot out to the woods and chop it up and burn it. My grandmother died in 2001, and it took a lot of stories with her. None of them ever wanted to talk about the things that happened out there. A few stories from her brothers have been told, but they took place inside the house. This story has always scared the heck out of me. I don't know if this creature was actually connected to the cot or if it was something from the woods. My grandmother was such a serious person, and she was visibly scared when she told me. I have never heard of anything like it.